Table 12, farthest from the string lights, closest to where the tide slapped the pilings. Adaeze Chuks sat with a glass of water she hadn't touched, and a clutch she kept adjusting on her lap, because her hands needed something to do. Nobody had brought her flowers, so she'd stopped at a corner stall that morning and bought her own, a small twist of white lilies wrapped in brown paper, and set them beside her plate as proof she still knew how to be kind to herself. 3 tables up, Marcus was loud on purpose. He had a laugh he used for rooms, the one built to travel, and tonight he was using it on Chloe, whose phone was already up, already recording, because Chloe had told 2 people backstage at the gala that she smelled a moment coming. "I still can't believe she showed her face here," Marcus said, not lowering his voice at all. "Some people don't know when to stay invisible." Chloe laughed into her glass. Adaeze cut her fish. She did not turn around. She had gotten very good, in 3 years, at not turning around. Then the hostess arrived at her table with 2 security guards, clipboard pressed to her chest like a shield. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with us. This event is invite only, and you're not on any list we recognize." Her eyes swept Adaeze's dress, her second-hand shoes, the modest little lilies, and made a decision about her in under 2 seconds. "She's a nobody. Get her out of here." That was when Marcus stood up, delighted to have somewhere to put his energy, and closed his hand around Adaeze's wrist, hard enough that her water glass tipped. The first guard's radio crackled, then the second one's. Then, from the direction of the marina gate, a sound the whole restaurant felt before it heard. 6 black SUVs, rolling in with their headlights off, doors opening in perfect unison, like something rehearsed. A wall of men in dark suits fanned out along the dock, and behind them, stepping off a private launch with his jacket already half off his shoulders, a man the tabloids only ever photographed from a distance, because getting closer than that had never ended well for anyone. Every phone in the restaurant turned toward the water. Nobody was filming Adaeze anymore. "Isn't that the investor from the shipping conglomerate?" someone whispered. "The one nobody's ever seen at a table." Another voice, lower, more careful. "That's not an investor. That's Himchan." The name moved through the crowd like a temperature drop. Himchan didn't look at the guards. He didn't look at the hostess. He walked the length of the deck in 11 long strides, straight to table 12, straight to the hand still locked around Adaeze's wrist, and peeled Marcus's fingers off one at a time like he was diffusing something. "Get your hands off my wife." The restaurant made a sound like all 400 people had been holding one breath between them. Chloe's phone drifted down to her side, forgotten. The hostess's clipboard slid out of her arms and hit the deck. Marcus's mouth opened, and nothing came out of it, because the woman he'd just called a nobody, the woman he'd dragged by the wrist in front of his new girlfriend, was apparently married to the single most dangerous man on the coastline, and had been for 3 months, and had never once mentioned it, not even when he'd humiliated her in this exact restaurant a year ago, and called it closure. Adaeze pressed her free hand flat against her chest, checking, almost, that her heart hadn't actually stopped. "Before I tell you what Himchan did to Marcus next, and why he chose tonight, this restaurant, this table, to finally show his face in public, you should know something. 3 years ago, at this same railing, someone made Adaeze a promise he had no intention of keeping. Tonight wasn't an accident. It was a bill coming due. I'm Adaeze. Drop your name below and tell me what you'd have done in that dress, at that table, before that yacht ever showed up. I'll be reading through the comments myself." The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, tucked inside a plain courier envelope, with no return address, which was how Himchan sent everything that mattered. Adaeze turned it over twice before she opened it, because in 3 months of marriage, she had learned that her husband did not do plain. The card inside was heavier than any paper had a right to be, edged in gold leaf that caught the light from her kitchen window and threw it across the ceiling in a thin, bright line. Seaside Gala, Saturday, Table 1. And beneath that, in handwriting she recognized, even though he had only ever written her 4 notes in their entire marriage, 3 words that made her sit down at her own counter. "Come as yourself." She read it 4 times. She was still in her work clothes, the gray cardigan with the paint stain on the cuff, her laptop open behind her, to a half-finished logo for a client who paid late and complained early. This was her real life, the one nobody at that gala would recognize her from, a rented 1-bedroom above a bakery, a graphic design business she had built out of spite and stubbornness after Marcus left her with his name still in her mouth and none of his money in her account. Him-chan knew all of it. He had married her anyway, in a registry office with 2 witnesses pulled off the street, no cameras, no guest list, because he'd told her that night that titles were heavier than people, and he didn't want her carrying his until she was ready to. Come as yourself. She didn't know what that meant for a woman who owned exactly 1 dress nice enough for a night like this, but she trusted him the way she had learned to trust very few things, completely and without asking why. She hung the invitation on her refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a sunflower and spent the next 4 days telling herself she wasn't nervous. By Saturday evening, she almost wasn't. The dress was wine red silk, second-hand but altered so carefully it looked new, and she had done her own hair because a stylist cost more than she wanted to explain to her bank statement. She looked, she decided, checking herself in the hallway mirror on her way out, like exactly what she was. A woman who had rebuilt herself once already and knew how to do it again if she had to. Him-chan had sent a car, black and silent and driven by a man who called her Mrs. Back, with a small bow that made her want to laugh and cry at the same time, because nobody had ever called her that before, not out loud, not where anyone could hear. The drive along the coast took 40 minutes. She spent all 40 of them with her hands folded in her lap, watching the water turn gold, and telling herself that whatever waited at Table 1, she would meet it standing up straight. The restaurant sat at the very end of the marina, glass and pale stone, and a private dock lined with boats that cost more than entire neighborhoods back home. String lights ran from post to post, like something out of a film. A hostess stood at the entrance behind a brass podium, clipboard in hand, dressed in black so severe it looked more like armor than a uniform. And Adaeze felt the old familiar tightening in her chest that she'd carried since childhood, the one that showed up whenever she walked into a room built for people who were not her. She gave her name. The hostess's eyes moved over her exactly once. Dress first, then shoes, then the small clutch that had belonged to her mother, and something in that woman's face closed like a door. "I'm sorry, I don't have you on the list. I was told to say Table 1. My husband arranged it." The hostess's mouth did something close to a smile, thin and unkind. "Table 1 is reserved for our most distinguished guests tonight. I think there's been some confusion," she said, confusion the way other people said thief. "This is an invitation-only event, and I'm going to need you to step aside so I can attend to our actual guests." Adaeze felt her face go hot. "I have an invitation. It's gold. It has the venue's own crest on it. I can show you." "Ma'am." The word came out flat, final, aimed at ending the conversation rather than continuing it. The hostess lifted 2 fingers, and from somewhere near the coat, checked 2 security guards in dark suits peeled off the wall, and started toward them, with the unhurried confidence of men who did this several times a night. "I think it's best if you wait outside. If your husband is truly on our guest list, I'm sure he'll come looking for you." The way she said husband made it sound like a word she didn't believe belonged in Adaeze's mouth at all. Adaeze stood very still, the way she had trained herself to stand still through worse than this, and reached into her clutch for the invitation itself, the heavy gold-edged card that had hung on her refrigerator all week. She held it out. The hostess didn't even look at it. "She's a nobody," the hostess said. Not quietly, not to Adaeze at all, but to the nearer of the two guards, already turning back toward the podium, as though the matter were closed. "Get her out of here, before she embarrasses herself further." The word nobody landed somewhere old in Adaeze's chest, somewhere that had been waiting 3 years to be reopened, and for one long moment, she thought about turning around, walking back to the car, texting Himchan that she'd changed her mind. Then she thought about the 4 words on the card, "Come as yourself," and she planted her heels into the marble and said, quietly but without a single shake in her voice, that she would be waiting right there at the edge of the dining deck until someone confirmed her table and that they were welcome to try to move her. The guards exchanged a look. Nobody had told them what to do with a woman who simply refused to leave. It was in the middle of that standoff, with the hostess's clipboard trembling slightly in her grip and the 2 guards shifting their weight, that Adaeze heard the laugh. She would have known it anywhere. That particular register Marcus used when he wanted a room to notice him, pitched just loud enough to carry over string quartets and champagne toasts. She turned, and there he was, coming up the steps from the valet stand in a suit, clearly bought for tonight and not for comfort, a woman on his arm, with long braided hair and a floral dress bright enough to be seen from the harbor. 3 years had changed almost nothing about him. He still walked like the room owed him something. He still laughed a half-second before anything was actually funny, testing the air to see who was watching. What had changed was the way Adaeze's stomach dropped at the sight of him. Not with longing, she'd burned that out of herself a long time ago, but with the specific dread of being caught in her rebuilt life by someone who still remembered the wreckage. His eyes found her before she could look away. She watched recognition move across his face in stages. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something crueler settling into place behind his eyes, like he'd found a joke he intended to enjoy for as long as it lasted. "Adaeze," he said her name, the way you'd say the name of someone you'd assumed was dead. "You're kidding me." The woman on his arm, Chloe, stopped laughing at whatever he'd been telling her and turned to look, first at him, then at Adaeze, sizing her up with the quick, practiced cruelty of someone who had learned everything she knew about other women from watching men decide their worth out loud. "You know her?" Chloe asked, delighted, already sensing there was a story here worth having. "Know her," Marcus laughed. That laugh, the traveling one. "We were engaged 3 years ago, right here, actually, this exact restaurant." He said it like a fun fact, like there was nothing underneath it, and Adaeze felt the old humiliation crawl up the back of her neck because he was telling it wrong, telling it like something that had simply happened to both of them equally, instead of something he had done to her on this exact dock, while she cried into a napkin and half the restaurant pretended not to watch. "Small world," Chloe said, though her tone made it clear she found it less a coincidence and more an opportunity. Her phone was already coming up out of her clutch, thumb finding the record button with the ease of someone who filmed everything, because somewhere in the back of her mind, she had already decided this was going to be worth posting. Marcus stepped closer, close enough that Adaeze had to fight not to step back, and dropped his voice into the particular register men used when they wanted to sound concerned while actually sounding like a threat. "Adaeze, come on. This is a $5,000 a plate event. Half the people here do business with my firm. You can't just wander in off the street because you saw it online somewhere." He looked at her dress, her shoes, the clutch that had belonged to her mother, and made the same calculation the hostess had made, only with more familiarity behind it, more certainty that he knew exactly what her life had become since he'd left it. "How did you even get past the door?" "I was invited," Adaeze said, and heard how thin her own voice sounded against the noise of the restaurant, the clink of glasses, Chloe's phone held up at an angle designed to catch both of their faces. Invited by who? Marcus's smile went sharper. Look, I get it. Things have been hard for you. I heard you're doing some kind of freelance thing now. But you cannot just show up at events like this and pretend you belong. It's embarrassing. For both of us. He reached out and closed his hand around her upper arm, not gently, steering her the way you'd steer something that couldn't be trusted to walk on its own. Back toward the steps, back toward the valet stand and the street, and the version of her life he'd decided she still belonged to. Let's just get you a car before someone recognizes you, and it becomes a whole thing. Let go of me. Adaeze planted her feet again, the way she had at the podium, but his grip only tightened, fingers digging into skin that would bruise by morning. And behind him, Chloe laughed into her champagne, delighted, filming closer now, narrating under her breath for whatever audience she imagined watching this later. Somewhere a few tables away, a violinist kept playing, oblivious, and the string lights swayed very slightly in the evening wind, and nobody at the surrounding tables moved to help, because a scene like this one, a woman being pulled toward the exit by a well-dressed man, read to a crowd of strangers as a private matter, a couple, a lover's quarrel, not a thing worth interrupting. You're causing a scene, Marcus said, low, close to her ear now, and there was real anger under it. The specific anger of a man who could not stand being seen, next to something he'd already decided was beneath him. You're ruining my night. Do you understand how many important people are here? I built relationships with these people for years, and you're going to stand here in a dress that looks like it came from a thrift store and embarrass me in front of all of them. Adaeze twisted her arm, and it didn't move an inch. Her mother's clutch slipped from her fingers and hit the marble. Chloe's phone caught all of it. The fall, the flinch, the tight white line of Marcus's knuckles around her wrist. And somewhere in the recording, Chloe's voice could be heard saying, low and thrilled, that she couldn't believe she was actually catching this on camera, that this was going to be the funniest thing anyone posted all week. It was in that exact second, Marcus's hand locked around her wrist, and the hostess already moving to summon more security, and Chloe's phone held steady and gleeful, that the first siren cut across the harbor. Not loud, not the wailing kind, just a single low pulse of sound rolling in off the water, like something announcing itself before it arrived. Heads turned all along the dining deck. A waiter froze mid-step, with a tray balanced on one palm. Out past the breakwater, headlights swept the road above the marina, 6 of them, then 8, moving in a formation too precise to be traffic, converging on the private lot behind the restaurant, and killing their engines all at once, all together, like a held breath finally let go. Black SUVs rolled to a stop across every exit from the marina, doors opening in the same instant, dark-suited men stepping out and fanning along the dock with the unhurried, practiced calm of people who had done this exact thing more times than anyone at that restaurant would ever want to know. The music didn't stop, not yet, but people stopped listening to it. Phones came up all along the deck, dozens of them now, not just Chloe's. And beyond the breakwater, gliding into the marina without a single ripple, without a single sound, but the low pulse of that one siren dying away, came a shape too large for the water it moved through. Black hull, gold trim catching the last of the sunset, running lights along its length, like something that had been built to be seen from very far away and understood immediately for exactly what it was. Marcus's grip on Adaze's wrist went slack without him seeming to notice, his whole body turning toward the water, one hand coming up to shade his eyes, the way it always did when something worth his attention appeared, because a man like Marcus could smell status from across a harbor and wanted a closer look before he decided how to feel about it. That's gotta be a delegation, someone murmured a few tables over. Or a head of state. Another voice, lower, more certain, said a name that made 3 separate conversations stop mid-sentence, and Adaeze, still holding her bruised wrist against her chest, still standing exactly where the hostess had told her a nobody had no business standing, felt every hair on her arms rise at once, because she knew that yacht. She had walked its lower deck once, 3 months ago, in the dark, with a man who had not yet told her what he really was, and she had thought, at the time, that she was simply falling in love with someone mysterious. She had not understood, not fully, not until this exact moment with the harbor gone silent and every guard on that dock turning as one body toward the gangway being lowered, exactly how much weight her husband had been carrying, quietly enough that she'd mistaken it, for 3 whole months, for nothing more than privacy. Comment below and tell me the last time someone underestimated you. Right before everything changed, I read every single one and I always reply. The gangway hit the dock with a sound like a verdict. For a moment nothing happened, no movement, no sound but the water lapping against the yacht's hull and the distant hum of a generator somewhere below deck. And then a man stepped into the light at the top of the ramp, and the entire restaurant seemed to lean toward him at once, the way a field of grass leans toward wind it can't see yet, but already feels. He wore white, a suit cut so precisely it looked less like clothing and more like something poured onto him, jacket open over a shirt, with the top 2 buttons undone, no tie, no watch, nothing that needed to announce itself, because everything about the way he moved already had. His hair was swept back from his face, dark and immaculate, despite the sea wind, and his expression carried the particular stillness of a man who had stopped needing to perform anger a long time ago, because he had learned that quiet did the work better. Behind him came 6 men in black, 2 with tattoos climbing out of their collars and up their necks, all of them moving with the loose, coiled readiness of people who were paid to notice everything and react to almost nothing. "Who is that?" Chloe whispered, phone still raised, though her hand had gone unsteady enough that the footage would come out shaking. Nobody answered her, because nobody at that table actually knew, not with certainty, only with the kind of half-recognition that comes from headlines about shipping conglomerates and offshore holdings and men who bought entire ports the way other people bought vacation homes. A woman near the railing said the name first, quiet, almost reverent, and it moved table to table across the deck like something catching fire. Himchan, the investor nobody photographed straight on, the man 3 governments had tried and failed to regulate, standing on this exact dock in a white suit with his jacket open and his eyes already moving across the crowd like he was searching for one specific face among 400. He found her in under 3 seconds. Adaeze watched her husband's expression change the moment his eyes landed on her, not softening exactly, but sharpening, the stillness in his face burning away into something with an edge to it, and she understood before he'd taken a single step that whatever calm he usually wore in front of her at home had been a choice, not an absence, and that she was about to see, for the first time in 3 months of marriage, what he actually was when he stopped choosing it. He crossed the dock in 11 strides. Guests parted without being asked to. A waiter dropped an entire tray of champagne flutes and didn't stop to pick them up. Marcus, still standing close enough to Adaeze that his cologne clung to the air between them, turned toward the commotion with the same idle curiosity he'd shown the yacht itself, a man checking to see who important had arrived, and it took him a full 2 seconds too long to understand that the important man was walking directly at him. Marcus. Himchan said the name like he already knew everything about it, like he'd carried it around in his pocket for months, waiting for a use. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The whole deck had gone quiet enough that even the violinist had stopped mid-phrase, bow lifted off the strings, watching. "You have 3 seconds to take your hand off my wife." The word wife landed across that dock like a physical thing. Marcus's hand, still loosely closed around Adaeze's bruised wrist from earlier, tightened instead of releasing, the reflex of a man too stunned to process an instruction, and Himchan closed the last 2 feet between them and took hold of Marcus's wrist, the way you'd take hold of something you intended to break. Marcus's face went from confusion to pain in under a second. Himchan didn't twist hard, didn't need to, simply applied pressure to a point just below the joint with the calm precision of a man who had learned exactly where that point was a very long time ago and had never once forgotten it, and Marcus's knees buckled beneath him until he was kneeling on the marble in his brand new suit, gasping, his other hand slapping uselessly at Himchan's forearm. "Let go of him. You're hurting him," Chloe said, though her voice had lost all its earlier delight, and her phone had lowered halfway without her seeming to notice. "He put his hands on my wife twice tonight." Himchan's voice hadn't risen at all, which somehow made it worse, made every syllable land harder than shouting would have. Once outside, when he grabbed her wrist hard enough to bruise it, and now, in front of 400 witnesses, while she stood here, having already told him to let go. He turned his head very slightly toward the nearest of his own men, a single small motion, and one of them produced a phone and held it up, screen angled toward the crowd, and Adaeze realized with a lurch that somewhere, somehow, someone had already been recording Marcus's hand on her arm from the moment it first closed around her wrist at the podium. "Everyone here just watched a man assault my wife twice. I'd like that clear before we continue." "Your wife?" Marcus managed, through gritted teeth, still on his knees. "Adaeze isn't. There's no way she's—" "Get your hands off my wife," Himchan said again, quieter this time, almost gentle, which was somehow more frightening than if he'd shouted it, and released Marcus's wrist all at once, so that Marcus caught himself on the marble with both palms, breathing hard, looking up at Adaeze like he was seeing her for the first time in 3 years, and understanding, finally, that he had never actually looked at her properly at all. Himchan turned from him without another word, as though Marcus had already stopped being worth his attention, and crossed the last few feet to Adaeze. Up close, his eyes were not cold at all, not the way they'd been for Marcus. They were the same eyes she saw every morning across their kitchen counter, and his hand came up to close gently around the wrist that had been bruised, careful, checking, his jaw tight with an anger he was visibly working to keep out of his touch, even though it hadn't left his voice. "I'm sorry," he said, low enough that it wasn't for the crowd at all, only for her. "I should have been here before you walked through that door." "You're here now," she said, and found that her voice, for the first time all evening, wasn't shaking at all. He kept her hand in his and turned toward the hostess, who had gone very pale near the brass podium, clipboard forgotten somewhere on the floor behind her. He didn't raise his voice for her either. He didn't need to. Every person on that deck was already listening. "Get me the resort director, now." The director appeared within 90 seconds, a thin, nervous man in a gray suit who clearly understood exactly what kind of night this had become before anyone explained it to him. Himchan didn't wait for pleasantries. 3 months ago, my holding company finalized the acquisition of this property. The paperwork closed quietly, because I don't like my name attached to headlines, but you'll find my signature on the deed if you check, and I imagine you're about to. He let that sit for exactly as long as it took the director's face to drain of color. That woman, and he nodded toward the hostess, called my wife a nobody and had her turned away from a table reserved in her own name. I want her escorted off this property tonight, and I want it done in front of every guest she made feel small this evening, because that's the only apology that would mean anything to me at this point. The hostess's mouth opened, closed, opened again. She looked at the director, who looked at his own shoes, then at the 2 security guards who had been prepared to remove Adaeze 20 minutes earlier, and were now, very visibly, deciding they did not want to be anywhere near this conversation. It took less than a minute. The hostess was walked off the dock, past every table she'd ever looked down on, past the violinist, who had started playing again, softly, as though even the music understood the room needed something to fill the silence with, and nobody at any table said a word in her defense. Marcus had gotten to his feet by then, straightening his jacket with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking, already trying to rebuild whatever composure he could salvage in front of the crowd that had watched him kneel. He opened his mouth, maybe to apologize, maybe to try to laugh it off the way he laughed off everything, and Himchan reached into his jacket and produced a single folded document that he held out, not to Adaeze, but to Marcus. "You should read that before you say anything else tonight." Marcus took it because he didn't seem to know how not to. Adaeze watched his eyes move across the page, watched his face change in stages the way it had when he'd first recognized her outside. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something that looked, for the first time all evening, like real fear. "This is a foreclosure notice," Marcus said, and his voice had lost every ounce of the swagger it had carried since he'd stepped out of the valet stand. "Your firm's largest creditor sold its position 11 weeks ago," Himchan said, "to a holding company you've never heard of, because I made sure you wouldn't be able to trace it back to me until I wanted you to. I now own 51% of your company's outstanding debt, which means, as of about 4 minutes ago when I signed the acceleration clause on my phone while walking up this dock, your firm is in default. Every deal you were planning to close with the people at this event tonight is finished before you shake a single hand, because word travels fast in rooms like this one, and I intend to make very sure it travels fast tonight." He paused, and for the first time, his voice carried something almost conversational, almost pleasant, which made it land harder than anything he'd said yet. "You spent 3 years telling anyone who'd listen that Adaeze was nothing without you. I wanted you to understand, in front of exactly the kind of people whose opinion you've always cared about more than hers, precisely how wrong you were." Marcus didn't answer. There was nothing left in his face to answer with. Chloe had already stepped back from him, phone gone from her hand entirely now, watching the man she'd been filming an hour ago, as though she were only now seeing him clearly for the first time. And when Himchan's men moved forward, unhurried, to walk the two of them off the property, neither Marcus nor Chloe said a single word in protest. The dock had already delivered its verdict. Nobody needed to hear an appeal. Himchan turned back to Adaeze once they were gone, and something in his face softened the way it only ever did for her, the anger folding away as easily as it had appeared, leaving only the man she actually lived with, the one who left notes on the refrigerator, and remembered exactly how she liked her coffee, and had apparently spent 3 months quietly dismantling the life of a man who'd hurt her, without once mentioning it, because he'd wanted, she understood now, to give it to her as a gift, rather than a burden. He shrugged out of his jacket and settled it around her shoulders, warm from his body, too large for her in a way that felt less like an accident and more like a claim, gentle and complete. The whole deck was watching, still. 400 people who had spent the last half hour deciding what she was worth, and had all, one by one, been proven wrong. "Table 1 is waiting," he said, and offered her his hand. She took it. They walked the length of the dock together, past the violinist, past the tables that had gone quiet again, but for an entirely different reason now, past the spot where her mother's clutch still lay on the marble, and one of Himchan's men bent without being asked, and retrieved it for her, handing it back with a small, respectful nod, as though he understood exactly what it meant that she'd carried it here. At the gangway he paused and looked down at her, the harbor lights catching gold in his eyes, and asked if she was ready to come aboard, not as a guest tonight, not as anyone's secret, but as exactly what she was. She said yes. They climbed the ramp together, his hand never leaving hers, and behind them, the restaurant slowly returned to its music, its conversation, its champagne. Every single person on that deck, now certain of one thing they'd been wrong about only an hour before, that the woman in the wine-red dress, who had once been called a nobody, was, in fact, the only person in the entire marina whose name actually mattered tonight. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who is about to find out exactly how wrong they were, tell me in the comments. I read every single reply, and I'll be picking a few to answer personally before the next chapter drops.